Now let's discuss a few other things involved with story mapping. Now, you might notice as you get your story map going and all your cards or your notebook or whatever you're using, you might find that, okay, wow, you have a bunch of great scenes, you can see your story and it's taking place, and oh my goodness, it's feeling like a real thing now, and you're so excited and you're ready to write. But before you do, we're going to talk real quick about some pitfalls, some things to avoid in your story map before you actually get down to brass tacks and start writing, right? And so let's talk about a few major things. Now, we know the rule about the protagonist. You have to love the protagonist. You have to empathize with the protagonist. You want them to succeed. They're the hero. You want the audience to relate to your protagonist and to really like them. However, one of the big pitfalls is don't force it upon us. It's really easy to see when, okay, we have a protagonist, but we can tell when that the writer is just kind of shoving it in our face. The audience can tell when you're overselling the protagonist. If you show him doing something super sweet, if you make him too sad, too empathetic, then the audience is not going to like it. So the idea is show us what we need to know to like the protagonist, but don't go above and beyond trying to make us like the person. So again, the goal here is we have to like the protagonist, but don't write in a bunch of, sad scenes or a bunch of overkill scenes just trying to make us like the person. Just give us a nice person that we can relate to quickly, that we can empathize with, and then get right into the story and let the protagonist's decisions become the reason why we like them. Don't oversell it. Don't make him overly sympathetic, because the audience, they want to like him, but they don't want to feel forced to like him. The second thing you want to do is you don't want to have an overlong exposition of stuff. So when you get to the setup at the beginning, don't just write and write and write and write about all these different details and backstories and all this information. If we don't need the information to make the story work, then you should cut it. And sometimes, you know what, cutting things, you might write a great paragraph, and in the end, you might look at it and think, well, no, it's a great paragraph, but it doesn't actually have to be in here to make sense. But the rule is, if you can tell the story without it, then you probably should. So get rid of it, get rid of that stuff. Only tell us in the setup what we absolutely need to know. Remember Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. That is all we need to know to get to the rest of the story about Humpty Dumpty. So when it comes to your setup, don't just start writing and just give us the whole life backstory and all the drama that happened for our protagonist. Just dive right in there. Only tell us what we absolutely need to know. Another thing that you need to know, and this happens a lot if you're writing very intricate storylines, or if you're writing futuristic or sci-fi storylines, one of the pitfalls can be you make it overly technical, overly too much mumbo jumbo, too much jargon. You might introduce a bunch of complicated things that the audience has to understand to get the story going, about a time machine, but the time machine only works on Thursdays at 7 o'clock. But you don't want to just overload the audience or the reader with so much information where they're trying to figure out in their brain, wait a minute, I don't understand the rules of this world and the rules of the science going on here. If it's very complicated, you need to simplify it as much as possible so that the reader or the audience doesn't feel like, okay, I'm completely lost. I can't remember all the rules for this world. So when you're writing, try to keep it as simple as possible, no matter what the genre is. Keep it simple. And if there's so much technical information that you're trying to get across where it's really taken away from the story, then that probably means in your story map, you need to go back and say, how can I do this simpler? Or tell this and use the technical information, but do it in a way that's not overkill for my reader or for my audience. Another thing is, don't strain belief in the story. You don't want to start writing and introduce some rules to the world where the audience is like, wait a minute, this would never happen, this could never happen. If you're writing something that's so fantastical that the audience can't really get their minds around it, then it's probably not good. It's always best to stick with a protagonist and some kind of real desire that people would relate to. If it's so ridiculous or so over the top, sometimes if we're straining the belief of the audience, they're just not going to engage and they're not going to like the story. So if you make a really fantastic world, try to keep the world simple, even though it might be fantastic. Lord of the Rings is a great example of that. Lord of the Rings has all kinds of mystical sort of people and groups and armies and all this kind of stuff. But in the end, the story is very, very simple. And so if the story is simple, you can introduce some things, but try to, don't strain the belief of the audience on the stuff. Another thing that we talked about earlier, but I really want to say it again when you're doing your story map, get to the inciting incident as absolutely quickly as possible. You want to introduce conflict as soon as possible. So only in the setup, give us as much information as we need, and then boom, hit us with the conflict. Let us know what happens as quickly as possible. And in fact, even ask yourself, do you even need much setup, or can you just start with the inciting incident? Can you start with the conflict? Because the goal, again, is get to it as quickly as possible. So only do the minimum amount of setup that you need to start the story, and then boom, hit us with the conflict as quickly as possible. When you're writing a short story, it needs to happen pretty quick. You don't want to be halfway through your word count before you hit the inciting incident, because otherwise you're going to have a really sad story. So look at your story map, say, where is my inciting incident? If it's here and there's 3 cards in front of it, or 3 blocks in front of it, is there any way to get that thing moved up any faster? And if there is, definitely do that. And the last thing, remember, everybody in a story, especially the hero, should change. We talked about their character arc. They start out over here. Here's your hero. And by the end, we need to see the character have some sort of character arc. There is some sort of what we would call a change that occurs within the story. And ultimately, the change actually should affect everyone in the story. By the time the story is done, the person that starts out at the beginning should be a different person because of what they've undergone throughout the story. They should be different, and the change should be irreversible, meaning once the story is taking place, they can't go back. They couldn't just say, well, I'm going to go back and be the way I was. No, because the story has been so dramatic, their character has changed. And a lot of times in great stories, not only does the protagonist change like this, but all the characters end up changing like this. They all end up going through some sort of change. They start out the story one way, but by the end, they've learned a lesson. They've done something. They've figured out, they've become more wise because of the conflicts that they've been dealing with. So whatever the case, look at your story map and say, okay, how is my character at the very beginning? And then how is he at the very end, or she? And are they the same person? Because if they're the exact same person, then it means that the whole drama didn't really mean anything. They didn't learn anything from the conflict. And so you need to be able to look and say, no, at the beginning of the story, he's ignorant, he's insecure of himself, he doesn't know, he's not very confident. But at the end, he has built those things. He is a confident, successful, whatever it happens to be. And here's why, because he had to go and undergo all this stuff. So make sure that there's a change involved in your protagonist for sure. And then once your protagonist, you've got that set up, then check your other characters and say, how are they changing? Because most likely you can figure out a way for all of your characters to change because of what's going on. So those are a few things to look at. When you're story mapping, get it all, lay it all out in front of you, walk through it with some friends or family, and then go over this list and say, am I making any of these pitfalls? Is there anything I need to adjust to make the story map better? So take a look at the examples below, and then let's look at the section project for this section.